Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and it's been a while, right? But we're back. Preseason week 1 is getting close to wrapping up. The Jaguars just played their game. For the first time as a Jaguars fan, they've actually beat the Chiefs. It's preseason. I don't care, quite frankly. I live near Kansas City. I've been waiting a long time for this. I could not give less of a crap. That's preseason. I just wanted to be him once in my life, right? But on a more serious note, we're going to talk about some of the players from this game, some of the starters, some of the depth guys, kind of what we've learned, and we'll do this for every preseason game. I will also just go ahead and say at the start of this that our plan for this next week, I hope to have a video out for all of you fantasy football people about maybe some Jaguars to target. We'll go in depth on that. I thought that'd be a fun thing. And then we'll get to week 2 of it. But with that all said, we're going to go ahead and jump in this. So Jacksonville, really from the start of this game, I guess they went down 3-0, but played really well. Scored on the opening drive, just looked like a good team throughout the majority of the game. Now, I've got some things that I will mention that I'm a little concerned about, but overall, pretty happy with the performance. Pretty happy with how everyone played. It was a good game for this team, but at the end of the day, of course, pretty meaningless, right? It's preseason football, but it gives you an idea of where some of these players sit right now. And so we'll kind of talk offense to defense here. The first guy that I have to throw out is Parker Washington. Now, a little bit of a mixed bag because Washington had a fumble on his big return. They did recover, I believe, so that's fine, right? But you want to protect the ball, especially when you're trying to make these big plays. A lot of these guys just almost forget to protect the ball, and it kind of kills the whole thing. So you want to see him be able to do that. And then there was also later another almost fumble for the team as well when he was on a receiving route. So that's a little bit of a concern, right? I want to see him be more protective when he's running after the catch. But overall, he looks dynamic. He looks like a legit potential starter in the NFL, which is wild. But obviously, the thing with Parker Washington that makes it kind of hard to hype him up too much is that he's a small guy, right? He's a slot receiver, and we have one of the best slot receivers in the NFL in Christian Kirk. And so you're not really going to be able to do a whole lot there with Kirk being on this team, but it's a really nice backup. He's always going to be that. So I was very happy to see how he performed. He was the immediate guy who stood out. I've got a couple plays from this game that I'll show you guys just to show you how good this was. But you see what I'm saying here. Now, this is a kick return, right? But the creativity for him. What was so good about Washington coming out of college, it was two things. One, it was the yard after catch ability, right? The other side of it, too, is that, well, he has a really small frame. Like, that's the major issue with Parker Washington. I think if you didn't have that, it's probably a really good starter in the NFL. But Parker Washington, despite that frame, this guy makes some incredible catches. He has really good hands. He's able to extend for the ball. He plays as if he's a lot bigger than he actually is. And so he's a fun player. Someone I was really excited to see have a good night for Jacksonville. Now, we've got some other receivers to talk about as well, because Brian Thomas Jr., the guy on this thumbnail, while he only got the ball once, had a really nice play. Had a 40-plus yard reception down the field. Showed really good ball tracking. Brought it in. Like to see that. I know there was a little bit of concern, like in training camp, just because he didn't really, I guess, dominate the way people thought. But this is a player that, like we mentioned earlier this offseason, you want to see him develop, but you're not going to immediately expect him to go out and be the elite wide receiver one, right? He is a guy with tools. He's a guy with the potential, but they're going to have to bring him along over time. And so it's nice to see some of those flashes coming in now, as you see with this 41-yard catch he had, which I'll play for you guys here as well. You see a really good play down the field, able to track it, tight coverage. I think it's even potentially pass interference. Still comes up with the catch. So really great stuff from Brian Thomas Jr. from this receiving corps. In general, Duvernay also had a great play down the field, hauled in a touchdown. It was a hard catch as well, one he had to adjust too late, and rolled into the end zone. So I was very happy with this receiving core. I don't really have a whole lot of things to complain about there. I think it's a really strong unit for this team. Now, getting into some other parts of this offense, the run game was interesting to me because I think the rushers did a really good job, especially as it got deeper into the game, where we had the backup offensive line, backup defense going up against the offense. This team was able to run the ball really well at that point, and the players, I think, were really good. I think Travis Etienne, early on, didn't really get a whole lot, right? But just kind of poor blocking from the offensive line with the starters. Now, give him Anton Harrison's not out there, Ezra Cleveland's not out there, and Cleveland is arguably the best run blocker on the team. So that's got to get factored in. But not a whole lot of movement for Etienne, but Etienne still managed to score. I think you could absolutely see him be a receiving threat this year, be a big part of that part of the offense. I'm really excited for what he can do there. But Etienne, I still think he played really well. I think he looked explosive, but the guy who stood out the most to me out of all the rushers tonight was Tank Bigsby. He got, I'll just be straight, he got a lot of shit this offseason. He got a lot of shit before that as well. He is a player who has been trashed, not really by the fan base too much, but just by people in the NFL. I've seen fantasy football people rip this guy apart like he is the worst player on the planet. And it's ridiculous, quite frankly, because this is a guy who came into a situation last year behind a really bad offensive line, as far as run blocking specifically, and especially on the interior, and was told, hey, you're going to be our short yardage guy. What did you expect, right? Is this a player who, in that situation as a rookie, who was already struggling, which I'm not going to defend every single thing, right? He did struggle as a rookie, and it's not all just other people's fault, but he was not in a good situation to succeed. That is not a good surrounding cast to put around a player that you want to pound out short yardage. But Bigsby tonight, I think he looked great. I think he looked explosive. He was able to get through gaps really quick. He was able to get downhill fast. He almost returned I think it was, I can't remember if they punted it or if it was just a kickoff, but it was after the safety. Almost returned it for a touchdown, but got tripped up as he was coming to the final defender. So really good stuff from him, and someone I'm really excited to see this season as a backup on this team. And I think that he's someone you got to kind of wipe your memory clean from last season and give him another shot, because he's not playing behind Luke Fortner anymore. Now, he's also not playing behind Creed Humphrey, but he is playing behind a much better offensive line than what he had before, and I think it's going to be a better situation. I think his head's in a good place. I think he's going to be really good this season. So overall, he was the guy who stood out to me the most of the rushers. Really, everyone played really well. I mean, look at these averages. We got 6.2, 5.8, 9.3, and then obviously you got some bad ones down here. This is kind of what I was talking about with ETN, where just not really good run blocking with the starters. That is the big question. It's been the big question for me all offseason. It's been the big question since, gosh, I think going into last season even. And that's going to be where I think this offense has something to prove. And if they can do that, it's a whole nother story for this team. I think that could be one of the best offenses in the league if they're able to do it. But that's the big question, right? Now, getting into tight ends for a moment before we talk about one of our backup quarterbacks and get on the defensive side of the ball, I didn't really see a whole lot from Brendan Strange today. I know he had one catch, so he was out on the field. I saw him early on, but he was out there after Luke Farrell. I think that's important to note. Farrell is, I believe, right now listed above him on the depth chart. That is a concern for me, given that Brendan Strange was a second-round pick 1 year ago. If you cannot pass up a player who was drafted in, the 5th or 6th round that long ago, that has really just been more of a blocking guy for the team, that raises a lot of questions. And then you also have another tight end on this team in Josiah DeGuara that I've heard people say he's similar to Brendan Strange in the way he plays. And DeGuara had a pretty good night. He almost had a touchdown late in the game, but he actually led the team in receiving. Oh, and that touchdown, quite frankly, getting to Mac Jones for a second, was a little bit of a misthrow. A little bit too far down the field, wasn't able to hit him. But DeGuara, he had a really good night, and so I don't think it's over for Brendan Strange, right? But I do think at this point that I'm not very confident in him being an impact player for the Jaguars. At this point, if you're getting beat out by the players you're getting beat out by, it's hard for me to look at that pick and say, okay, this is going to turn around. Things are going to get better. You can do that with some guys. So I just don't know if Strange is going to be one of them. But ultimately, he was the guy I wanted to see more from. But DeGuara had a really good night. He might be the tight end 3 on this team. I think he's a player that will probably make the roster as long as they're carrying 4 guys. If they aren't, probably not, just based off the simple fact that a second-round pick was invested in the Brendan Strange. And even if he doesn't perform as well, I don't think you can move on from that player this quick. So it doesn't really make sense for the team to do that. Now, getting to our last offensive guy, though, Mac Jones. Really good night. Completed 9 passes, 98 yards. Almost had a touchdown, but a little bit of a miss on the throw, like we mentioned, the one to DeGuara. But really efficient, played well. We've talked about it a little bit since he got traded here, but this is a really good situation for Mac Jones. I think it's better than what he had in New England. A lot of pressure has been taken off of him. He's back home. I could absolutely see him being a player that gets comfortable here, who is able to develop, who's able to kind of reset his game, and maybe at the trade deadline, someone comes calling and says, hey, we need a starter. Can we get Mac Jones from you? And you get a good deal for that. Maybe you get a little bit more than what you sent to New England, or at worst, whenever the season ends, someone maybe goes and signs him. I don't know if he sticks around long-term as a backup. I think that's unlikely because I think this is a player who should get in their starting chance in the NFL. But ultimately, Jones had a really good night. I think he played better than CJ Beathard did, and I think he should be the QB2 on this team, which I've felt like for quite a bit longer than tonight, to be honest. Now, going to the defensive side of the ball, I will say my main concern right off the bat, and this went away as the game progressed and different players got on the field, but the run defense was not as good as I wanted. Now, there were some stuffs. It was not just bad, right? But at the same time, there were some plays early on where you just almost ask yourself, where are the defensive linemen? Like, we got guys running up the middle of the field like no one's there. And it kind of goes back to what we talked about with, like, Mason Smith, for example, where when he was picked, one of my frustrations with that, and I'm not going to sit here and say it was the wrong pick right off the bat. We got to see how their careers develop. But to me, with losing Fadakasi this offseason, right? And obviously you get Devon Hamilton back, and that helps a little bit. But this team had a clear weakness in run defense on the interior. You brought in Eric Armstead. He has pass rush upside. When I looked at that unit, it was the run defense I was concerned about. And so that's why one guy we hyped up a lot was Chris Jenkins Jr., because Jenkins was a guy that was a really good run defender right off the bat. Eventually, he was probably going to be a very good pass rusher as well from the interior. And I thought that would be a much better fit. Instead, Jacksonville elected to take Mason Smith. I almost want to say Mason Graham every time I say it, but Mason Smith. And he's not a bad player. I'm not saying anything like that, but Mason Smith is a pass rusher. That is what he's good at. Run defense has always been questionable with him, and I think at best, he'd probably be an average player. So I have some concerns about the interior of that defensive line against the run. I think they've got something to prove there. Now, one guy that has kind of impressed me so far and got on my radar from watching the deep dive from that franchise guy, and I'll butcher his name. You guys can tell me in the comments how I said it wrong, but Isezi Otamawo. So Isezi, we'll just call him that. He comes from their team. He's a guy who's kind of bounced around for a while, but Isezi had a really good night. He's been a pretty good run defender, and he's someone who's kind of been overlooked in the league. But He came out, he had a sack and a half, he had multiple tackles. This was someone who contributed. And so I think it's possible that maybe he could come in and help a little bit with run defense, but ultimately, that's a unit I have some questions about. I want to see them be able to perform better there because if you can't stop the run like that, what are you going to do against teams that have good interior offensive lines and can run it up the middle? There's not going to be much of an answer, and eventually you're going to let something go deep because you're going to be too focused on stacking the box, or you're just going to get gashed all night. So I want to see that improve, right? But ultimately, a lot of good things to say about this defense if I look past that. And I think there's just a lot more positives than negatives. Now, Terrell Edmonds, one guy who really stood out, I think, as far as the big hits he was making. He was someone who was popping guys all night. And you saw a lot of that physicality from the defense, especially once we got past the starters and started getting into the depth of this team. A lot of big hits, a lot of forced fumbles, some really good moments from this team. I'll show one from Terrell Edmonds here, which is really nice. You can see him pop Cornell Powell pretty damn hard there. Now, of course, ball bounces straight back to Powell. Bad luck, I guess, but big hit, right? Like, there was a lot of that from Jacksonville. I like to see that. It just felt like once we got past, like, halfway through the first quarter, they were a lot more physical than what Kansas City was bringing. So, like to see that. They just got to keep that up, though. I want to see that from the offense, or sorry, not the offense, from the starters on the defensive side. And if they can do that, I think that's going to change a lot of things for this team, because physicality, probably one of the top things I would mention that was an issue last year. It was that, it was run blocking, it was some other things too. But physicality goes a long way. I think those teams are the ones that usually do the best in the NFL. I was happy to see Jacksonville show a little bit of that tonight. Now, one guy on the defensive line I think is worth noting is Roy Robertson-Harris. And it's not exactly for good reasons, but Robertson-Harris was out really deep into the game. He was out here all the way through, I think, the third quarter. Don't know if he played the entire quarter, but he was out there for a long time. With the amount of people that they've brought in for the defensive line, the amount of overhauling that they've done, I wonder what the role is for him going forward. And I wonder if he's someone who could possibly not make the 53. Now, given salary cap implications here, I do think that with Roy Robertson-Harris, that he is going to either make the roster straight up, most likely, if that's what's going to happen. If he doesn't, it's a situation where he kind of has to be traded at this point. I don't know if Jacksonville can actually cut him, and we'll take a look at that just to make sure I'm right here. But he's got a lot of guarantees left. You got to keep in mind, he signed an extension with the Jaguars back after the 2022 season. We are on the second year of that, and I believe 2023 was the last year of his original contract. So we go down to Roy Robertson-Harris and compare it to a trade. They're going to save about $1.7 million being able to trade him. So there's a decent amount there that the Jaguars would be able to get. I've heard a little bit of trade buzz with him, just people mentioning it as an idea, nothing from the team, anything like that. But I do think it's possible that we could see a trade with him if he's not playing earlier in the games or with the starters here. So that's one guy to note. And I think it was interesting seeing him being out there so late in the game. But getting towards more of the secondary guys, I think Christian Braswell has to be the guy you bring up when you talk about cornerbacks tonight. Now, Tyson Campbell not out on the field. Didn't really see anything that blew me away with Darby. Nothing bad either. But the one guy that really stood out was Christian Braswell. Guy came to play. Got robbed of a huge play tonight against, I think it was Nico Remigio, where he just ripped the ball out of the guy's hands after the catch and ran it back for a touchdown. Now, unfortunately, they claimed that he was down on that play and that basically Christian Braswell got to him while Remigio's knees were still on the ground. It's close. It went Kansas City's way, is what it is, right? But I do think that it was an impressive play that is going to stand out to the coaching staff. I think it's something that could help him make the roster. You look at what Ryan Nielsen has done since he came in. He has come in with a clean slate, right? There was no depth chart early on. It was guys earning their roles. It was guys having to prove it. And Christian Braswell, I think, is one of those guys who's starting to prove it a bit. And so we'll have to see if he makes the roster. I could definitely see it. That was a big play. He also had another big hit late in the game. Just had a really good night. And probably the guy that stood out the most in the secondary. But the final person I got to mention here before we finish this up, Cam Little. Dude's awesome. If there was a reason why I gave him the best grade I did of all the draft picks. That's not saying Cam Little is the most important player. But for what they spent and what they got back, that was the pick I was the most confident in. Of course, given it's a kicker, right? But Little was a guy coming out of the draft who had a huge leg, had a ton of upside. It was just a little bit of the accuracy issues, but super young player. He's someone who was probably going to be a starter in the NFL and someone who's just been great so far. You know, Riley Patterson's off this team right now for a reason because he was straight up beaten out by Little. Little was hitting kicks from 64, 65, could have gone almost as far as 70 in pregame warm-ups and attempted a 62-yarder today after forcing a safety, by the way, which I could credit him, but it's also kind of on the Chiefs player for, having the safety happen. But Cam Little nearly hit a 62-yarder. Now, yeah, did he miss? Sure, but it was a pretty damn close kick. Still had a long of 47. He was hitting kicks all night. He played pretty well. Just that 62-yarder, missed a little wide, plenty of leg. If he's able to tone that in, which I think he can, I think he has the mentality to just get better and not really let this stuff get to his head, I think he's going to be a phenomenal kicker. I think that's someone we're going to have here for a long time, someone who probably gets an extension down the road. We'll have to see. Haven't got to the regular season, but I feel really good about Cam Little and what he's able to do for Jacksonville. So, with all that said, I think that's all I've got from this game. Now, in the future, we'll probably wait a couple days after games. Probably not for preseason, but once we get into regular season football, because I want to get PFF grades as well. Be able to talk about that, get a little bit more analysis on the team in that regard, because it does help a lot in just getting everything set up in a general direction and noticing things that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise. But that's what we got here, right? Want to know to start off preseason. Record doesn't matter much, but good game against a really good team. Want to see this stuff continue. Want to see some of these problems get fixed, but ultimately I'm impressed by the performance. So appreciate y'all watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Tune in this week if you want to check out some fantasy football related stuff, but otherwise we'll be back next weekend as well for game 2 of preseason. So have a good one, and finally, go Jags.